It's not the time that we have that's the problem. It's what we do with the time. You see, it was in 1971, and I was working on a business degree, and I was in a marketing management class, and I was taught for the first time the Pareto principle. I can still remember as I was being taught this incredible principle, and I'm writing it down and trying to grasp it from the professor that day. I can still remember saying to myself, if I can grasp this well and practice it well, this will change my life. I knew back then that what I was learning in that classroom that day had life-changing potential for me. And I have become a student and a practicer of Pareto all of these years. Because that day, while I'm writing these notes down, I realized two things. First thing I realized was that I was doing too many things in my life. And the second thing I realized was I was not only doing too many things in my life, I was doing the wrong things. That's a recipe for disaster. Doing too many wrong things. That never turns out right. Let me make sure you get the Pareto principle down right now. Pareto says the top 20% of your priorities will give you an 80% return if you spend 80% of your time on the top 20% of your priorities. It's a very, very simple, but it's a life-changing principle. And I want to make sure that you get it because I've watched 2080 work all of his life. And so what happens is this. You prioritize your life correctly, the top 20% of your things. In other words, you have 10 things to do. If you have 10 things to do, here we go. The top 2 things will give you an 80% return. So here's a person doing 2 things, getting an 80% return. Here's a person doing 8 things and getting a 20% return. It's not how hard you work, it's how smart you work. That's why you have to evaluate or stalemate. Because what happens is every one of us have got to make sure that we got our priorities right and that we're only doing the top 20%. Pareto basically says, if you've got 10 things to do, you should be doing 10 things. He says you should just be doing basically 2 things. Spend 80% of your time on doing 2 things. Don't, because that's where the return is going to be. 20% of the roads have 80% of the traffic jams. And 20% of the students will participate in 80% of the classroom discussion. In business, 20% of the customers will bring in 80% of the profits. And 20% of the employees will generate 80% of the problems. Oh, isn't that fun, huh? If you got 20 people working for you, you got about 4 of them that they're work, aren't they? Huh? They're working for you, but you got to work on them all the time. 20% of the salespeople will generate 80% of the sales. 20% of the information produces 80% of the decisions. 20% of your results come from 80% of your time. And isn't this true? 20% of the people will eat 80% of the food. Huh? Go to a picnic and, hello, they're gone. 20% of them take care of it. Now that's a lot of fun, but let me tell you something. This 80%, it just totally works in your life and my life. So when you look at this and you say, okay, if I do these 2 things, I'm going to get this kind of return. If I just spend 80% of my time right here doing these 2 things, if I could just do this, I'm going to get 80% return. So let me tell you, there are 3 questions that help you determine your top 20% priorities. Okay, so what gets in my top 20% of my priorities, and they all begin with the letter R. The first one is requirement. What is required of me? Very simply, I've got to ask myself, what do I have to do that no one else can do except me? That's the magic question. I've asked that question. My goodness, it's life-changing. The second R is return. What gives me my greatest return? In other words, when I do this, it just really is profitable, okay? What's my return? And your return is always going to be in 3 areas. Giftedness, what are you gifted in? Experience, what have you done well and you're proven successful in? And growth, what are you learning and what are you growing in? Because what you're learning and growing in is what you're passionate about, and what you're passionate about almost always has a good return for you. So requirement, return, and the third R is reward. What is rewarding in my life? What is rewarding to me? Because whatever that is, you're going to migrate to that anyway. Because people do what they want to do. People do what they love to do. That's the passion question. Now, here's the key. And the reason I'm teaching this 3 hours with Pareto is very simple. Because we're trying to figure out what that top 20% is so we can get that 80% return. Are you with me? Yep. And the 3 hours will help you get your top 20%. That'll help you figure that out. You know you're there when you line up the 3 R's.